I was staying up till 2 o'clock in the morning a lot of nights drinking and doing drugs, and I'd go back to bed and get a couple hours of sleep. And one of those nights, I woke up right as I went to sleep, and my heart was blowing out of my chest. I started having a panic attack. I thought I was going to die. I crawled into a bathroom in solitude, and Angela didn't wake up. I wanted to call out to her and tell her to call an ambulance, but I knew if she did, they'd take my blood and find out what was going on. At that point, I thought she would take everything and leave.
Welcome to the Fairest Love podcast. Here we explore spiritual insights and practical strategies to help you cultivate a family life rooted in beautiful, self-giving love. Join us as we invite experts to share uplifting perspectives and actionable advice for navigating the joys and challenges of modern family dynamics.
Welcome back to the Fairest Love podcast. Happy Tuesday, everyone. I'm really excited about this episode. Today, I am joined by John Edwards, also known as Just a Guy in the Pew. Hi, John. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's an honor to be with you. Thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to, just this time together and seeing where the Lord takes all of this.
Yeah. Before we started recording, John and I were just chatting, and I realized I better hit the record button. Otherwise, we just keep talking and talking. So really excited as well to see where this conversation is going to take us. For the viewers who may not be familiar with your story and who you are, could you share a little bit about who you are, what you do, and the journey that brought you here?
Yeah, so my name's John Edwards. I'm going to be 48 in November, so I'm 47 currently. Father of three. I have three wonderful children, and my son Jacob, who's 16, going on 17, a junior in high school, and identical twin, red-haired, hazel-eyed girls that unfortunately look like me, so they're going to have a tough life. But Jacob won the lottery. He looks like his mother. But and I'm married to my beautiful wife, Angela, and we've been married for since June the 2nd, 19 years. So
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. We live here in Memphis, Tennessee. And, I was born and raised Baptist, was really involved in my faith from a young age, went to an Episcopal school, played sports, did all of that, wound up in a public high school playing sports. And about the age of 18, a lot of my friends went off to college. Being here in Memphis, for those who of your listeners that may not be familiar with the geography in the area of the country and all of that, Memphis is one of the largest cities in what they call the Mid-South. So you got like Atlanta and Nashville, and Memphis is a big one. And it's surrounded by a lot of Southeastern Conference schools, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Ole Miss, all those.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people whose parents settled down in Memphis, they all went to those schools. And so when we got to the age of about 18, a lot of my friends, my community, my youth group, which had been my lifeline, a lot of those folks started to move off and to go to college and follow in their parents' footsteps. And I didn't really have that. My dad went to Ole Miss for about a half a second before he was drafted in the Army.
Okay.
My mother went to the Mississippi College for Women, which I tried to get in there a couple of times. I thought it might be good odds for finding a wife, but they seemed to continue to reject my application.
I
But
wonder why.
yeah, but so I didn't really have that alma mater, and so I've always been here native in Memphis in my life. And my sisters both moved off to college. I have a younger and older, and have moved back since. But yeah, Memphis was just always my home. And when I got to the age of this youth group kind of disbanding, I was, let me just say this, like I wasn't really popular at school. I talked about the Lord a lot. I was evangelizing Baptist, and you would think that was okay at an Episcopal school, but I was kind of made fun of a lot for how much I talked about the Lord. I was constantly going to church camps and vacation Bible schools and all these things and helping people find the Lord. And so I found my home and my family in the youth group. Now I had a little bit of a difficult, situation with my dad growing up too. My dad was one of 6 kids raised on a farm in Mississippi, and he and my mother met down in a town below Oxford where Ole Miss is, dated from the 7th grade, were married, moved to Memphis for work. And he was a basketball star that had aspirations of playing at the highest level. And then, like I said, got drafted. But, my dad was one of 6 kids. His parents didn't get along. I didn't know that until later in life. My grandfather died the year I was born, so I never met him. I never saw that relationship. But my dad, he was the youngest of 6. They were raised kind of as farm hands, and so there wasn't a lot of I love yous or I'm proud of yous. It was just sort of go to school, do your chores, work, and, you got a roof over your head and place to sleep and something to eat. So you should know that you're appreciated and loved. So I didn't get a lot of that growing up. I didn't hear that I'm proud of yous and I love yous. And, I had the wound of inadequacy, which is the root wound for all men.
Yeah.
That's the real wound for men is, am I enough? Am I going to be enough, for my wife, for my children, for my dad, for God, whoever it is? And So I struggled with that because I didn't really receive that affirmation from him, and wound up going off to college here locally at Memphis, and didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and kind of was lonely for the first time in my life. All my friends had left. There was nothing else for me in the Baptist church. There was a void from youth to elderly. There was no young adult or anything in between. So my life became work and school, and unfortunately my need to belong, and which is a good need, to want to be part of community. We're made for communion with one another and God, but I found that in the wrong place in a fraternity, and it led me to some pretty dark places in my life.
Yeah.
So when my friends leaving, it really left a wound that I didn't understand. And, just this loneliness. My dad had looked at me when I was 16 and said, get off the couch and get a job. I was playing sports. But when I
Mhm.
wasn't playing basketball, he's like, you need to do something with your time besides sitting around. So I started to work for an auto parts company that he worked for as a higher level executive. And I started loading
Yeah.
trucks and doing things like that, and did that into college. And as I said, I never was one of those people that was like, man, I want to be a doctor. And, 10 years later, I was a doctor, or I want to be this or
Yeah.
that. So kind of entered in and said, well, I can't play basketball. I thought I was going to, and I blew out my knee in my junior year of high school. And so that dream went away. And so I thought, well, I'll enroll and see where, what happens, and, what I might want to do in my life. Well, very quickly, I realized how isolated and alone I was. I was surrounded by thousands of people and didn't know a soul. I was trying to
Mhm.
talk to people and get to know people and couldn't find a way in. And it was just a very difficult time in my life. And I was going to my Baptist church still. I would go to the service on Sunday because there wasn't
Uh-huh.
really anything else for me my age. And ran into a friend of mine's mother that I thought he had gone off to college somewhere else, but he was at Memphis, and he was 3 years older than me. He always kind of let me hang out with him when I was younger and let me run around with the older kids. So she said, you ought to give him a call. And I did. Turns out he was a rush chairman for a fraternity at Memphis. And he said, John, I know what it's like coming to school and starting over and finding new friends. A
Yeah.
fraternity really helped me. Maybe that could help you.
Mhm.
And he said, "Hey, we're meeting tonight. Actually, we're about to start rush season, and we're going to be at the strip of bars by the University of Memphis. And if you want to come up here and hang out with us, then maybe if we like you and you like us, we can give you a bid." Now, when I say I was Baptist, like my family was really Baptist. We didn't. There
Yeah.
was no alcohol in the house. There was no drinking. There was no dancing. I had messed around a little bit in high school with a beer here or there, but like I
Mhm.
didn't. I was an athlete, so, and I was definitely afraid of like my father's vengeance. At the time too, of those things. So I never knew what it was like being around a lot of that. So I go up and we get in, I go up and meet the guys at the bar, and there was lots of pretty ladies, and, and they were nice to me. I was nice to them. There was a lot of drinking. And the next morning I got an invitation to join the fraternity. I accepted it. And that was the first time or the last time that I went to church for many years of my life. I
Okay,
started to
wow.
walk. Yeah, I started to walk away from everything. All of a sudden, like these wounds that came up of this communion. And I just want to say that for your listeners that, this I've got a book out now called Power Made Perfect, Finding True Strength in Christ. And
Mhm.
that alludes to a verse by St. Paul that we can cover later in Second
Yeah.
Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. But it also goes back to the beginning of what was lost in the garden. A lot of people, they don't personalize that. We go,
Mhm.
okay, well, Adam and Eve bit the apple, then everything's been horrible since. And, and my life is just I'm a victim of their mistakes. And we are, that is true, but also we lost something in that too. It's not some distant fictional characters that,
Yeah.
something happened to. We all lost that. And what I came to understand was, we were originally made, like I said, like for love, by love, for love, and through love, right?
Mhm.
For love, through love, by love, and for love is the catechism would say. And so we were born, we had this original divinity, this original justice, the catechism calls it, and JP2 alluded to it. We had this divine friendship with God. We were clothed in robes of glory. And then all of a sudden, this mistake happens, and those things are stripped from us. And so there's been something missing inside of all of us. And that's the thing that we try to cover up and to fill in our lives. No matter what
Mhm.
it is for each person, we can get everything the world promises and still not be happy, not be joyful. And there's a difference
Yeah.
between happiness and joy. And what that is this power, this original love and relationship with God. And that's what we strive for. So I was at this place where I was like looking for something to fill the hole of
Mhm.
the community that I lost. So when you have good community and communion, that's awesome with the Lord,
Yeah.
with others. When you don't, it could be very detrimental. And so
Yeah.
that's where I found myself. All of a sudden, I get in this fraternity and I look around and I'm like, man, well, who does everybody like? Because I want to be popular again. I want to be loved. I want to be, have opportunity to meet beautiful girls and maybe to
Mhm.
find a wife and, things
Yeah.
like that. And so I looked at what they were doing and saw pretty quickly that they were drinking, they were promiscuous, they were, messing around with drugs and things like that. And so I started doing the same things because I wanted to be liked. I wanted to be included. I couldn't, as an extrovert, I could not stand being by myself and alone all the
Mhm.
time. And the life just work, school, work, school, work, school.
Yeah.
And so pretty quickly I started doing what they were doing. And it started with just a little bit of drinking, which turned into binge drinking, which turned into smoking pot, and then getting into, people's pills cabinets, parents' pill cabinets, Valium, Xanax, those kind of things. And then it moved to LSD and ecstasy, things like that. And
Mhm.
then eventually I made the worst mistake I'd ever made in my life, which was to try cocaine. I was over to one of those guys' houses on a Sunday, been watching football. We were drinking and smoking weed. And eventually I got up to leave to go home because I knew I had to go to
Mhm.
work the next day and realized I was pretty intoxicated. So I got up and I started looking for somebody to drive me home. And oddly enough, I guess I'd been so out of it, I wasn't really paying attention that there wasn't anybody even in the room. So I go looking through the house and come back to this back bedroom, and I hear some voices and open the door, and there's guys standing over a dresser and they have lines of cocaine in front of them. Now I'd never been around cocaine other than seeing it
Yeah.
on TV or whatever. But for some reason, I was like, man, that's one out of everything else I did. I was like, that's something that's gonna be hard to come back from. It just alarmed me so much that I literally went, "Whoops, sorry," and shut the door,
Yeah.
almost as if you'd walked in on somebody changing or something. "Whoop, my bad,"
Yeah. Yeah.
and I started to walk out, and the door opened behind me, and one of the guys came out and basically said, "Look, like, we've been hiding this from you because we didn't know if we could trust you, and, you know, but you've seen us now, and I also heard that you're looking for a ride home. If you just take one of these lines, and it's like drinking 4 or 5 cups of coffee. It'll wake you up, you'll be able to drive, like, you'll be okay, and you can get home." Now, I'd had one sip of black coffee when I was young, my dad's when I was, like, 4, and I thought it was disgusting, and I've not had
Mhm.
any coffee since in my life, 44 years later, and so I had no reference, but I knew this, and this was a real just defining moment in my life where I picked the
Yeah.
wrong option, but I knew that if I walked away that I would be alone again, and to me,
Mm.
that was the greatest pain in my life, and I thought, "Well, I know I shouldn't do this, but what's the greater loss here? Losing friends and being alone again, or doing this one time?" So I did it. I went
Oh.
back to the den. I sat there. Rubbed my arms and was rocking 9-0, and my mind was racing and all this stuff. And I thought, man, I wish I'd done that. I wish I'd done that. When is this going to stop? And about 45 minutes later, I started to kind of calm down and the feelings started going away. Got in my truck, went home, and said, I'll never do that again. In fact, I started making what my good friend Dr. Bob shoots. I work in the John Paul II Healing Center men's
Mhm.
ministry portion with him and Sister Miriam and
Yeah.
Father John Burns and all those wonderful folks. And but Bob would say, like, there's these things called unholy vows where we start making vows of, like, I'll never do that again. I'll never do it
Mhm.
alone. I'll never be like my father. And there's one
Yeah.
person that loves those things. It's the devil. And he loves to, like, get in those places and go, "Oh, really? Let's see about that," and to start to
Mhm.
kinda stick his
Yeah.
thumb in them. And so very quickly, I started falling to those things. Every vow I made, I started to break. I went back around the friends. We started doing cocaine regularly. I dropped out of school because I was no longer going to class. I was just partying. And
Okay.
I started working full time at the auto parts place. Very quickly, I became really good at what I did. I moved up all through the ranks and became an outside sales guy. I was, a Fortune 250 salesman of the year, 100% commission, making $300,000 a year as a early
Wow.
20-year-old. And it's a little bit different. I know you're in California.
Yeah.
$300,000 in California is not a lot. In Memphis, Tennessee, you might as well own the
Well, even
place, right?
here, that means you're living pretty comfortably.
Yeah, yeah. I just know the prices and things out there are a lot higher than they
Yeah.
are and, like, cost of living and all that stuff, but yeah, so I was doing well, but I kinda took pride in the fact that I'd forged my own way and didn't need higher education and all that stuff, but
Mhm.
really it was all masks, and that's what I became
Yeah.
good at. I was a chameleon among men, and I could be anything
Mhm.
to anybody. I was a broken mess inside. I was a successful guy, I had everything the world would tell you need as a man, money, cars, house, all this stuff. And I was just a broken mess inside, man.
Yeah.
And nobody knew because I was so good at hiding it. Even my
Yeah.
friend group that we were doing cocaine with, they started graduating and maturing, but I kept on and got to a place in my life where I was very lonely again. I had everything, but I had no one to share it with. And I
Mhm.
found myself into other addictions, binge drinking, drugs, and then pornography because I was isolated and alone, and those addictions just built on one another. And
Yeah.
at that point in my life, I would just treat Jesus like a genie in a bottle. My relationship with him was I only talked to him when I needed something. So I would get lonely and I'd pull my Jesus lamp, if you will, no disrespect to him, but
Yeah.
off the shelf, and I would blow the dust off of it and go, all right, let me rub this lamp, and Jesus, I need this, this, and this. And if you
Mhm.
give it to me, then I'll be happy. And if you don't, then I won't, and
Yeah.
always negotiating, always brokering and, with Christ in that. But one day he did answer my prayer. He put a woman in my life. I was out with some friends and thought we were going to be partying. And it turns out they all left that night early. And here I was with a pocket full of cocaine and no idea what I was going to be doing. And Angela, my now wife, was a
Yeah.
girl that I knew in college. She actually had dated a very good friend of mine for a number of years. I thought they were going to get married. And turns out I was there when they broke up. I'd been there a lot of times when they broke up, but it stuck this time. And here, 5 years down the road or whatever it was, we ran into each other, and
Okay.
she called me over to the table, and we started talking that night. And eventually, I asked her out, and later that night, and we started to date, and we were married a year later. So I want to stop
Wow.
here and see if you've got any questions in the midst of
Yeah.
all this so far.
So, okay, I want to give you a chance to catch your breath too, because
Sure,
you've
yeah.
been sharing so much, and that's amazing. You're touching on really interesting themes of loneliness and wanting to fit in, but then also I noticed that you kind of touched on inadequacy. And this
Hmm.
is a train of thought that I want to follow real quick because I think that this is something that a lot of people nowadays struggle with is this idea of inadequacy. And so I've been thinking about our culture's push for independence and
Hmm.
not necessarily in the founding fathers, that type of
Sure,
independence,
yeah.
but more so in this, you got to be a really independent, for women, it's, being an independent woman, you don't need a man, you can just do this by yourself. And then I think you're kind of what you're sharing in your story is in the same way you want to be liked, but then you also want to seem very capable and not inadequate and you want to have it all.
Mm.
And that's kind of the image of a man that our society promotes is this guy who is super macho. He's got the cars, he's got all the women. And I think that it creates this very isolating community for people
Mhm.
is because what I think we get confused with is I think that people want to be capable. Like you want to
Mhm.
be able to figure out life. You want to be able to be a functioning
Sure.
adult. But I think we overstretch to a point where we're so independent and we don't need anyone. We view people as kind of just a means to, get what we want.
A means to an end, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, we're searching for this community, but because we don't know how to find that balance, we find that community in the wrong thing.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right, and, I mean, this is the basis for toxic masculinity that you've heard for years and years and years. Some of that is just angry people trying to blame somebody for things,
Yeah.
but often, like, men have also sometimes helped create that image because, honestly, what you're saying, like, this kinda over aggressive and, guy that's like, "I don't need anybody or anything," and I could think of, I won't name them because I don't wanna bring them any more attention, but a lot of different men that are on social media and saying a lot of things that are, a lot of men are flocking to because they're looking for answers, but they're going to the wrong thing. And
Hmm.
honestly, what that is still inadequacy. It's just, I
Yeah.
feel so inadequate and I feel like I'm not enough to the point where I don't like to feel that way. So now I will over engage in arrogance and everything else. And like, I'm just going to try to outrun that pain, that wound, and be something that I think will allow me not to be hurt or to be dealing with that anymore. And so what you do is you wind up hurting other people,
Hmm.
and you start using people. And we look at ourselves as our own gods. And that's what the world 100% tells you. Go out and do what you want, be who you want. Doesn't matter. You want to change your body, you want to, do whatever, do it like as your God, and you don't have to answer to anybody.
Yeah.
And that is very isolating because that pulls you away from the truth of God. It pulls you away from the church. It pulls you away from what God intended us to be. We were made for each other.
Hmm.
St. Paul talks a lot about the members of the body of Christ and how every member matters. And so even sometimes in some of the Protestant, versions of Christianity,
Yeah.
you could hear like, oh, it's just me and Jesus, and me and
Hmm.
Jesus running through the tulips. And it's like, well, yeah, like that's you're supposed to get to know Jesus so Jesus can inform you of who God the Father is. And then you can come up to understand that God's not some cosmic, angry, judgmental police officer that's waiting to punish you when you die. He's a loving father. And if he's loving, then that means you're beloved and that you're a
Hmm.
beloved son or daughter. And when we can live in that identity, then we can find the freedom that we're called to. But the world and the flesh and the devil scream from the rooftops that, like, no, no, you need to be your own man. You don't need anybody else. God can't love you. You're no bigger than
Hmm.
your worst mistakes. You're no better than your worst day and all those things. And a lot of people believe in that. And so they kind of isolate. Then you throw this global pandemic on it from a few years back, and that doesn't make it any better either. But the
Yeah.
truth is, one of the reasons we exist in men's ministry, the whole heart of our ministry, just a guy on the pew, the podcast, we've started over 100 groups around the country for men, the leadership
Wow.
summits we do. All of that is to combat this silent epidemic of loneliness and isolation, where you
Mhm.
have men puffing their chest out and I'm good, I don't need anybody or anything. But then they're interiorly, they're like a scared child holding a teddy bear against a wall, hoping someone sees them. I have a
Yeah.
great image of that I show in my talks where it's a guy that's you see the profile of his face and he's smiling from the side, and then you can see in his head, and it's a little boy with his head on his arms on his knees, bent up, and then he's holding a teddy bear. And this
Mhm.
is where a lot of people are, and we have the wrong idea of masculinity. The world has told you what it means to be a man is to work hard, to never complain, to never have feelings, never have emotions, right? If you
Yeah.
do, don't tell anybody. That's not a man. If you need somebody, you're not tough enough. So just do what? Grin and bear it, rub some dirt on it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and just get going because nobody cares, right?
Yeah.
Nobody cares. And so I'm sorry, but I never remember Jesus Christ ever in the gospel saying, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right?
Mhm.
We need each other. We're made for that community. And so, to your point, in a world where there's more isolation, loneliness, which affects self medication, when I'm told I can't share with people, when I can't be honest, when I can't be open, when vulnerability is looked
Mhm.
at as a terrible term because it means weakness and things
Yeah.
like that in the eyes of the world, then we wind up with men that are angry, that are hurting, that have nowhere to go, that wind up, going to self medication. I'll just drink 10 beers a night. I'll, do a drug of choice. I'll get addicted to pornography. I'll, step out on my wife. I'll, whatever it is. And this is where society finds itself, especially for men today. Men make up 50% of the population, that make up 80% of the suicide. Men are four
Yeah.
times more likely to consider suicide than women.
Mhm.
31% of Catholic men claim to not even have one real friend. 15% of them say they have no acquaintances that they would call even an acquaintance.
Yeah.
You look in parish life, 6 out of 10 men say that they don't even know the name of other men in their parish. So, to your point, and I'm speaking specifically to men in this
Yeah.
context because of my story, I know it's very similar for women too. We've started women's groups around the country
Mhm.
using the same model and methodology that we use for men, but it is a problem. And the world wants you to go out and get everything by yourself, but then you turn around, and you have nobody with you. And this is why
Mhm.
you see so many people. I'll see men at men's conferences that are 65, 70, 75 years old, and they got more money they could ever spend in their life. They got everything they would ever need, and they're
Mhm.
unhappy and they have no memory with their kids and, no real friendships and relationships, and nobody really knows them. And at the
Yeah.
heart of this, my friend, these are the three things that people want the most summed up into one. Every one of us, I don't care if you're the toughest guy in the world, the meanest, toughest woman in the world,
Yeah.
whatever, we want to be seen, loved, and heard. We want to be seen,
Mhm.
loved, and heard. We want to be known. It's what we were created for, to be known by our God and to be known by others. And so when we get out of that, you can find yourself in places much like I did in my story where we've gone through so far is just out there looking like, okay, I got everything the world told me I should have. Why am I still lonely? Why do I still
Mhm.
hurt? Why am I still not enough? It's because we're looking for things in the wrong place.
Yeah, for sure. And I know you've mentioned having talked with older men who have had huge success in their life, but now they're finding that they have no real community. Do you think the pandemic in 2020 and that whole lockdown, do you think that increased this feeling of isolation? Do you think that it's getting even harder for young people and for young families to find community, or do you think it's always been this way?
Yeah, I think to a degree it's always hard once life starts changing again in different
Mhm.
spots. I mean, just like aging out of the fraternity. Well,
Yeah.
I wanted to be with girls in my life, like to have a girlfriend, but I was 26 and all the people in the fraternity were 19 and 20, and
Mhm.
I wasn't going to bars. I wasn't going to church where I could meet somebody. So, yeah, a lot of times in our life, we find ourselves in different situations where it's hard to even come across someone with the same values, with the same,
Yeah.
whether you're talking about a relationship, somebody you're trying to date or even a friend in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. And then, we're all innately selfish from the fall, right? We want what we want, and then you isolate people for 2 years and they become angry and very inward focused and what I want and what I need and so yeah, you have this natural kind of growth of an issue that was already kind of happening.
Yeah.
And we don't realize that we think the key to happiness is getting what we want, doing what we want, being our own God and our own ruler, but
Mhm.
that's never makes us happy. It never does. Ever does it make anybody happy. And like we're made, like I said, for community. So, and I see it in young people too. I mean, during COVID, I was fortunate to be one of the founders of Virtual Catholic Conference. A lot of the online Catholic conferences that were done
Mhm.
in an attempt to try to break through the isolation. People couldn't go to church; they couldn't receive the Eucharist. So
Yeah.
myself and two other guys built this thing on a whim that took over the Catholic Church for a while, and really provided a lot of places for people to come together. And specifically, even in those conferences, when I would look at talks that like Dr. Peter Kraft or Father Mike
Mhm.
Schmitz or something gave, like you could read the comments and people were just hurting. They were lonely. They
Yeah.
some of them were choosing, but then like I love my life like myself, but I'm unhappy and I'm da 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 da.
Mhm.
So really not finding a place to go. And I think that's a problem that society always has until we start to be secure in our own identity, who we are, and most importantly, whose we are,
Mhm.
and understanding that, then we can go, okay, if my life isn't my own, it's a gift from a loving God, and I can live in gratitude for that, then I can live in generosity. And through that generosity, I want to share what's been done for me. And I want to pass on this gift of knowing that we're all in this together and doing life together and accompanying one another. So that's obviously, or not obviously, because we haven't really talked about it, but where my story kind of wound up was going into some serious times of darkness and loss. And then the Lord meeting me in those places and bringing me back into communion, but this time in the right place, in the right church, and the right people, and being able to move forward and have my life changed and then be called to go and help others do the same.
Yeah, and so to that point, my next question was gonna be, okay, so we talked about
Yeah.
where we are, where, the state of this isolation and loneliness, and so the follow-up question was, how did you get out of it
Yeah.
when in your story?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the grace of God. I mean, the story I'm telling you and the way it's going to wind up, and you can read even more details than I could ever share. I think some people have gone like, I've heard his story before, watched about the book, because
Yeah.
everything people come up to me afterwards and go, well, "What about your dad and you? What about your wife and how did y'all heal?
Mhm.
And what do you?" That's all in there. I don't have time to get in a podcast all the time or an hour long
Yeah,
talk. So
exactly.
some of those details people have been waiting for forever in there, but I would just say this that, I met Angela. She was Catholic. As we started dating, she said, the man I'm going to marry is going to be Catholic. And, I thought I was the man for the job. I didn't go to church anymore. And, what did it matter? If that was a hoop I needed to jump through to marry her, I'd be
Mhm.
glad to do it. But I never took it seriously. And, I was one of those guys that thought, like, I'll just grow up and I'll mature. Life will happen to me and I'll magically, like, put down drugs and,
Yeah.
just mature. And I think a lot of people fall into that. That's how they fall into addictions is, well, one day when it's time to grow up, I'll grow up, and
Mm.
we wind
Yeah.
up with this never ending Peter Pan syndrome, of
Yeah.
like, this is how you have guys in their 50s in their underwear playing video games in their parents' basement. Like,
Mhm.
it's just like that. That's how we wind up in that place. And some of that also with, we don't have rites of passage really anymore for people like we used to and things like that. We could go off on a tangent there, but
Yeah.
in my particular story, I never took it seriously. I thought I would stop doing cocaine when I got married. I was doing cocaine till 7 in the morning the night before I got married. I
Wow.
thought when Angela came to me and said she was pregnant with our first child, Jacob, that I would stop then because I wanted to be a better dad than my dad was to me. And I love my dad. I loved him. I love him. I love him. And he was an imperfect man. He was an imperfect father, just as I am. And my children could say the same thing about me. But, my dad provided for us. He worked two jobs. That was his way of showing love. Not
Mhm.
that I'm proud of using, I love using the attaboys. And he came to my ball games and usually told me everything I did wrong instead of, the I'm proud of you. But that's how he showed his love. So long
Mhm.
story short, I was like, I just want to be a more present father. I'm not just going to teach Jacob to play basketball. I'm going to play with him. What's important
Mhm.
to him is going to be important to me. I'm going to make time for him. And I thought I would do that, but I didn't realize, being a 100% commission sales guy and, there was a number I couldn't hit. So my bosses kept putting more and more jobs and customers on top of me. There's more and more stress. I was a good dad when I wanted to be, but it wasn't a lot. Wasn't long after that, my mother, who had had breast cancer years before, the cancer came back and was
Mm.
actually in the room when a doctor, for the first time I'd ever gone to an appointment, doctor walked in and told her that it had moved from her breast into her lymph nodes, into her lungs, into her brain, and that she was going to die. And she wound up dying not long after that, and it tore me apart. That was the last straw with God, and I got very angry
Mm.
because here I was, this kind of lying scumbag, drug addict, loser that nobody really knew. I had everybody fooled, and I hated myself. I was disgusted with myself. And in the midst of this, here's my mother who was, always put everybody else first and loved people well and loved the Lord. And why was she going to have to die? And then, a lying scumbag, drug addict like me got to live. And so I was very angry with God. I told him I'd never worship him again after my mother passed. And
Mm.
Angela and I became kind of like ships passing in the night. She saw the drinking. She never knew about the drugs. I never did enough around her to where she would be suspect until she would go to bed or something, and then I would kind of jump into it. But because a lot of people ask that question, how did your
Yeah.
girlfriend and wife never know like all these
Yeah.
years? And it's because I was smart. Like I was trying not to get caught. So I only
Mm.
did enough around me to satiate myself so I wouldn't be jonesing for it or
Mhm.
or all those things, but or withdrawals would happen for it. And then when she'd go to bed, I would just, sit up front and drink. And it was my mother's death, while not intentional, wound up being a cover for me because my wife saw the drinking and thought, well, he's just mad and he needs to process. And maybe, a week or two, this will get out of him and he'll, get back to normal. And I didn't. I was
Mhm.
angry at God. I was angry at the world. I just was mad and was turning to the wrong things. So it wasn't long after that Angela came to me and said, I'm pregnant with twins. And I thought, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? How am I going to pay for this? Like, I know what daycare is for one kid, and oh my gosh. And
Yeah.
so the stress hit. I wasn't there for her the way I should have been. She was seeing to the kids, and I was staying up till 2 o'clock in the morning a lot of nights drinking and doing drugs. And I'd go back to bed and get a couple hours of sleep. And one of those nights, I woke up right as I went to sleep, and my heart was blowing out of my chest. I started having a panic attack. I thought I was going to die. I crawled into a bathroom in solitude, and Angela didn't wake up. I wanted to call out to her and tell her to call an ambulance, but I knew if she did, they'd take my blood and find out what was going on. At that point, I thought she
Yeah.
would take everything and leave, and so all this was a struggle. And I realized I was having a panic attack. I slowed my breathing. I promised myself I wouldn't do it again. And the next day, I was back buying drugs and found myself in the same bathroom in the same situation the next night. And it was then that I realized I needed to do something different. All I wanted to do was tell somebody the truth of my life. So there
Mhm.
was a men's conference coming up, and I thought, well, I've been Catholic for 11 years, and there's this thing, confession. I've only been once, but if I remember correctly, the priest can't tell anybody if you tell them something. And maybe if I just get it off my chest, I'll feel better, I'll quit, and I'll move on. I
Yeah.
didn't realize how addicted I was.
Mhm.
And so I went to confession at that men's conference. I told the priest the truth. He gave me absolution. I thought I was through. I threw away the drugs and poured out the beer when I got home. I made it 4 days. That next week was Holy Week. And
Mm.
I sold something huge at work on Thursday, several $100,000 worth of equipment. It came in
Yeah.
on Holy Thursday, and I wanted to celebrate. And unfortunately, instead of going to pick up my son from my father in law's after school, I called a drug dealer until he picked up the phone, went and picked up drugs, and the police were watching his house. And I wound up being arrested on Holy Thursday.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Fairest Love podcast. If you would like to get into contact with John, head to justaguyinthepew.com. You can find his socials, podcast, and contact information on his website. If you're interested in purchasing his book, Power Made Perfect, you can also find the link for that on his website. They currently have 2 Father's Day bundles if you're still looking for a Father's Day gift, so I would recommend checking that out as well. As always, you can find us on socials, and you can always connect with us via our website at thefairestlovefamilyproject.com. Thank you so much again for listening, and we're excited to see you next week for part 2.